You know what's wild? Sometimes a case comes along that has everything: celebrities, politics, mystery, murder, international intrigue. And yet, somehow, it gets lost in the shuffle of true crime history. This is one of those cases. A case that honestly reads like a Hollywood thriller, except it's all devastatingly real. Let me take you to January 23rd, 2000 in Mesa, Arizona. It's a regular day, or at least it starts out that way. A delivery driver was making his rounds to a Bosch's grocery store located at McDowell and Power Roads. Just a routine delivery, nothing special. But as he approached the store, he noticed something unusual from a distance. A 1997 Jaguar pulled up to the store's dumpster. The driver was a woman, and she got out of her luxury car, walked around to the trunk, and pulled out what appeared to be a large, heavy object. She struggled with it for a moment, then heaved it into the dumpster before quickly getting back in her Jaguar and driving away. Now, people throw all kinds of things in dumpsters, right? But something about this woman's behavior, the urgency, the furtiveness of it, struck the delivery driver as odd. Call it intuition, call it curiosity, but something told him to check out what she'd thrown away. He walked over to the dumpster and looked inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Lying among the garbage was a human torso severed between the breastline and the knees. No head, no arms, no legs, just a torso. The delivery driver immediately called the Mesa Police Department. When detectives arrived and began processing the scene, they realized they were looking at a carefully executed dismemberment. This wasn't some crime of passion where a body was hastily hidden. This was systematic. Whoever did this had taken their time. But here's the thing about dumping a body from a bright, expensive Jaguar in broad daylight. It's not exactly subtle. The delivery driver had gotten a decent look at the woman, and detectives were able to work with him to create a composite drawing. They also started tracking down that Jaguar, and it didn't take long to trace it back to a woman named Valerie Pape, a 47-year-old French citizen who lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. When a second witness came forward and identified Valerie from the composite drawing, police knew they had their suspect. Valerie Pape had been born in the city of Rennes, France. She was married to a man named Ira Pomerantz and owned an upscale beauty salon in downtown Scottsdale, the kind of place where wealthy clients came for high-end treatments and to be pampered. On the surface, Valerie seemed to have it all together. Successful business owner, married, living in an affluent area. But scratch beneath that polished surface, and you'd find something much darker. Police went to her Scottsdale home and brought her in for questioning. And this is where Valerie's story started to fall apart, or rather, where it kept changing. In her first version of events, Valerie told police that she'd come home to find her husband lying dead in a pool of blood. She claimed she panicked. She didn't know what to do. Instead of calling the police like any normal person would, she said she decided to go to work at her beauty salon. Just went to work, left her dead husband at home. Then, she said, when she returned from work, she took his body and dumped it behind the Bosch's grocery store because she was afraid she'd be blamed for his murder. Detectives listened to this story and immediately noticed what was missing. They asked her about the dismemberment. How did her husband's body end up cut into pieces? Valerie had no answer. She just went silent. While Valerie sat in the interrogation room, detectives obtained a warrant and searched her home, and what they found completely contradicted her story. In her purse, they discovered a receipt for a reciprocating saw, the kind of power tool you'd use to cut through bone. that she'd purchased from a Scottsdale hardware store. They also found a bullet underneath the rear seat of her Jaguar. When detectives confronted Valerie with this evidence, her story changed again. Now she admitted to shooting her estranged husband. She claimed they'd been involved in a domestic dispute when she shot him. She said she'd kept his body for 4 days before finally dumping it behind the grocery store. But she still denied any knowledge of how his body had been dismembered. She maintained complete ignorance about that part, as if the torso had just magically separated itself from the rest of the body. Detectives weren't buying it. Valerie was a petite woman. There was no way she could have done all of this alone. The physical act of dismembering a body requires strength, stamina, and frankly, a strong stomach. They were convinced she must have had an accomplice. Meanwhile, the media had latched onto this case like a dog with a bone. They were calling it the torso murder, and it was front-page news across Arizona. At her hearing in the Superior Court of Maricopa County, Valerie pled guilty to killing her estranged husband. Her attorney argued that the killing was the result of a domestic dispute that had occurred on January 23, 2000. When investigators started digging into Valerie and Ira's history together, they found exactly what you'd expect to find in a case like this: a pattern of domestic violence. There were past records of domestic disputes between the couple. There were restraining orders. This wasn't a happy marriage that suddenly turned violent. This was an ongoing nightmare. But as the Attorney General continued investigating Valerie's background, the case took some unexpected turns that added layers of intrigue nobody could have predicted. Remember that upscale beauty salon Valerie owned in downtown Scottsdale? Well, it wasn't just a salon. She also had an art gallery attached to it that displayed work by local artists. One of those artists was a man named Rusty Bowers, a state senator from the city of Mesa. When Bowers heard about Valerie's arrest, he was absolutely shocked. He told reporters, "She is a very gentle, decent person, and I'm astonished at this." He found it incomprehensible that Valerie could have killed or dismembered her husband. Now, Bowers's administrative assistant was a woman named Merle Bianchi. It was actually Merle who had been responsible for introducing Valerie to Bowers in the first place. And Merle backed up Bowers's assessment of Valerie's character completely. But Merle had even more to add. She told detectives that Valerie had confided in her about being afraid of Ira Pomerantz. She described a specific incident when Valerie had called her in distress, telling her that Ira had thrown knives at her during an argument. Merle had let Valerie stay with her to get away from him. In Merle's words, Valerie was the most kind, warmest, most gentle person you ever met in your life. She was naive and trusting. So you've got these two very different pictures of Valerie emerging. On one hand, a woman who shot and possibly dismembered her husband. On the other hand, a gentle, kind person who was herself a victim of domestic violence. But here's where things get really strange. In 1999, just a year before all of this happened, Merle Bianchi's husband, Ron Bianchi, was found murdered in the forests of Payson, Arizona. His killer was never found. The case remained unsolved. When authorities from Gila County who were investigating Ron Bianchi's murder heard about the Valerie case, they started paying very close attention. The connection was too close to ignore. And then things got even weirder. A local newspaper, the Arizona Republic, ran an article that made a shocking claim. They insinuated that Ron Bianchi had been murdered because he was investigating an alleged affair between Senator John McCain and singer Connie Stevens. Now, there was absolutely no evidence to support this claim. None. It was pure speculation, and the article was quickly dismissed. But it gives you an idea of how wild this case was getting, how many different threads were weaving together. Politics, murder, conspiracy theories, all swirling around Valerie. As the investigation continued and all these findings came to light, the district attorney reached a conclusion. After reviewing all the evidence, the history of domestic violence, the circumstances of the shooting, they became convinced that Valerie had not acted with premeditation. This wasn't a carefully planned murder. This was a domestic dispute that had escalated to a fatal shooting. Based on that determination, they charged Valerie with second-degree murder rather than first-degree. On August 20th, Valerie was offered a plea deal. And this is where things get interesting. The deal was this: she wouldn't have to reveal who had helped her dismember her husband's body if she agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder. Think about that for a moment. The prosecution was so certain that Valerie had an accomplice, and they were willing to let that person remain anonymous in exchange for Valerie's guilty plea. Who was she protecting? Why was she so determined to keep that person's identity secret? We'll never know, because Valerie accepted the deal. Now, here's where international politics entered the picture. On November 7th, the Arizona State Prison placed Valerie in the custody of the U.S. Marshals Service. The plan was to deliver her to a federal transfer center in Oklahoma City, and from there, she would be turned over to French authorities. The director of the Arizona Department of Corrections, Dora Shiro, had approved the international transfer. Remember, Valerie was a French citizen, and apparently there were arrangements being made to have her serve her sentence in France rather than in an American prison. But that plan got derailed quickly. Ira Pomerantz's daughter, the victim's daughter, expressed serious concerns about the transfer. She was worried that if Valerie was sent to France, the French government would release her on parole far too early. She wanted to ensure that Valerie actually served real time for killing her father. The daughter's concerns were taken seriously, and the international transfer was dropped. Instead, Valerie Pape was sentenced to 16 years without parole in an Arizona prison. You know what bothers me most about this case? We still don't know the whole truth. We know Valerie shot her husband. She admitted that much. We know there was a long history of domestic violence in their relationship. But who helped her dismember the body? Why was she so loyal to this person that she'd protect their identity even while accepting a plea deal for murder? And what about Ron Bianchi's murder? Was it really just a coincidence that Valerie's close friend Merle's husband was murdered just a year before all this happened? Or was there some connection we're missing? This case has all the elements of a Hollywood thriller: the glamorous beauty salon owner, the state senator, the unsolved murder, the international transfer negotiations, the mysterious accomplice who was never identified. But unlike a movie, we don't get all the answers tied up neatly at the end. Valerie went to prison for killing her husband. Justice was served, at least partially. But the full story, that went to prison with her, locked away behind her silence about who helped her dispose of Ira Pomerantz's body. And that mystery remains unsolved to this day.